And that looked at these themes again from the perspective of the karmic faiths. One of the things that we discovered when we worked on this book was that Christianity had had a very negative impact on the views that the karmic faiths had about sexuality. So for instance, just to show you how this works, today we speak about Hinduism. There was no religion called Hinduism when the English arrived in India. There were thousands of religions, and the English found it inconvenient to have to talk to these multiple different faiths, and so they called them one religion, Hinduism, a joint name, brought them all together and said, you'll all be Hindus. You can have your different beliefs, but we'll call you all Hindus. And that opened our eyes to the way in which Christianity has been very negative in terms of images that it has portrayed to people in different settings. And so, honestly, the book that I want to speak about this afternoon is the one that we have just completed. And that is a book that is called A World Once Whole, Constrained by Colonized Faith. And in this book, we examined what the attitudes about dignity and sexuality were in indigenous spiritualities and traditions. And so we gathered together people from 7 of the world indigenous communities. The first, of course, was the Sapmi, because we felt that being based in Sweden, it was important for us to be able to engage with the Sapmi. We then spoke to the First Nations from North America, the Polynesians based in Hawaii. We also spoke to the Aboriginal people in Australia, the Lumad in the Philippines, and then the other 2 faiths that we looked at specifically, spiritualities and traditions, were the Amazight in the north of Africa, who some people also call the Berber, and the last group was the Khoi San from southern Africa. And as we looked at their understanding of the world, their understanding of dignity and sexuality, one of the things that they all said to us is, we cannot look at sexuality separately from the world, because sexuality is part of who we are. Sexuality is a part of our being. And the way in which they engage with their understanding of the wholeness of who we are as people is dramatically different from that which we see today in our world religions. I'll give an example which just displays how different people thought about things. Amongst the Khoi San, once a year, the elders of the community would get together, and they would say, how have the rains been? What is the grazing in the land like? How many young have the animals in the field had? How many children do you think our community can afford to raise this year? All right, we can afford to have 5 babies this year. And then they will gather the women of the village who are of childbearing age and ask them, which of you is willing to have a baby for the community? And 5 women will volunteer, and it doesn't matter who the men are. And coincidentally, the elders of the community, of course, are mostly women because they happen to live longer than the men. So the elders, who are women, have gathered the women together. They've made this decision together. And the one thing that we know is that by using herbs from the field, they know 2 very important things. Number one, they know how to prevent pregnancy, and the second thing they know is how to terminate pregnancy if they need to. And this is an inherent knowledge that they have and that they have lived with for thousands of years. The shaming about bodies and the shaming about the image of our bodies and the shaming about how we express our sexuality is a much younger thing. It's a thing that comes really from the way in which St. Augustine interpreted Christian faith back in the 3rd century. When St. Augustine, for the first time, starts speaking about original sin and how sinful we are in our expression of our sexuality. And from there comes the notion that you have to be male or you have to be female, and if you're a male you can only be attracted to women, and if you're a female you can only be attracted to men. And this whole notion of breaking down our sexuality into a very narrow binary only comes into our faith in the 3rd century. One of the things that we explored in this book, Behold, I Make All Things New, was precisely the fact that not one of our sacred texts, whether we're talking about the Torah or the Bible or the Quran, encourages homophobia. Not one of them. Not one of them is looking at sexuality in a narrow way. But we have begun to interpret it that way. A good example of that, if we talk about something like homosexuality, is that the word homosexuality itself, which is now translated into some versions of the Bible, is a psychological term that is only created in 1835. 1835. So before that time, there is no word homosexuality. So when the writers of the Bible wrote their passages, they could not have written about homosexuality because it didn't exist in the way that we understand it today. The Amazigh, who are in the north of Africa, are the people who we read of in the Bible. And so it was very interesting when we were looking at the Amazigh faith community, their spirituality and tradition, that the Baal, that much of the Old Testament is written to challenge and separate the people of Israel from, these people still exist. These are the Amazigh. They still live in the countries of northern Africa, and you can still find these communities, particularly in Libya and Tunisia. And so these Amazigh, the Berber, are the people who worship Baal and Ashtarte. And as we spoke about this and as we understood who they were as a people, and this notion that fertility comes from Baal and Ashtarte, and the way in which your lands are fertile, the way in which you make sure that it rains, is that you have to go to the temple prostitutes and you have to there have sex to excite Baal and to excite Ashtarte. It's a ancient pornography, if you like. You have to excite them into wanting to have sex with each other, and then it rains. Then you have fertility. Then you have the land being able to support people. So this exercise, or this linking, if you like, of sex and sexuality with creation is something that we find common in all the ancient traditions and spiritualities of indigenous people. And we examine it in this book, A World Once Whole, Now Constrained. I'm going to stop there because I'm told that we only have about 4 minutes left, and I want to give you the opportunity to ask questions of me if you have questions. Anyone? And I'm a preacher, I can talk for an hour. So, so that's no problem. But if you have questions, please just indicate and we stop there. So the Sami people, this is a very interesting one for me to talk of, because it was critical for us that we had to have a contribution from the Sami people. But when it came to looking for someone from the Sami community who was both a person of faith and a person who expressed sexual diversity, gender diversity in their personal makeup, in Sweden we could not find one who could speak to us. We eventually had to go to Norway to find someone to speak to us. And one of the reasons is because the version of Christianity which had been taken to the north was so constrictive. And so people from Sami origins that we encountered who identified as gay or lesbian, bisexual or transgender, these people had chosen to leave the faith community because they could not reconcile their sexuality with their faith. And that's a great blight on the kind of messages that we have given from the Christian church. How we have narrowed down people's expressions to what we are comfortable with rather than what God has created them to be. We saw this in the passage that we have, or the couple of chapters in the book that we have dealing with the Sami from that Norwegian perspective. You have the whole drive, in the same way as we saw it in Sweden, of the Norwegianization of the Sami people. You're not allowed to be your own person. In fact, you will be scorned if you speak your own language, if you have your own faith representation, if you do not fall into the Christian box that we think it is necessary to be for you to be authentically Norwegian. And of course the same was true in terms of the Sami community, thank you, in Sweden. And what justified all of this? What justified this was the doctrine of discovery that had been written by Pope Nicklas in 1452 and then emphasized again by Pope Alexander in 1493. And the doctrine essentially says that if people are not Christian, then they are subhuman, and therefore you can take ownership of them and of their land. And to this day, that doctrine has not been written off the books. It still exists. That is a short summary of the work that we have done. Thank you very much for listening to me this afternoon.